Hi, everybody. So, this next module is about how organizations, both in the public and nonprofit sector, work together. But I wanted to start out by just recapping briefly, some of the different perspectives about why nonprofits exist and serve the community. Obviously, market failure is, one big reason. But sometimes, as I've mentioned, there is government failure, or what I refer to as public value failure. And that's where, there are services that the government, theoretically should be providing, but is failing to do so. Um, there's also something called contract failure theory. And this is where you have a breakdown between trust between for-profit providers and consumers in a marketplace. So, like having a nonprofit organization that doesn't have that profit motive can help to instill trust in consumers that the relationship and the transaction will be fair. So, some great examples: medicine, any sort of healthcare, daycares, and childcare services. But also education, especially when you consider very recently the shutdown of for-profit colleges that were largely considered to be low-quality diploma mills that were abusing the system. So in these cases, you often see nonprofit organizations that fill in the gaps because there is some sort of skepticism toward the motives of for-profit organizations. Um, Something else to really point out here is that service delivery has started moving downward from the federal level and outward. So both downward from federal to state level. So I'll get into the mechanics of that in our next video. But also it's been going outside of the government territory to the private sector and to the nonprofit sector. Um, And sometimes, there are times when the government has to step in and provide financial assistance for cases where we have what we call voluntary failure. And that's when the nonprofit sector just isn't able to provide enough services. So, often this is done through grant funding or sometimes it's contracts or other mechanisms. Um, this can be problematic though, because you have the potential for loss of autonomy in the organization. Strings always come attached with government funding. Also, that the issue of vendorism and mission creep. It's the idea that you're just going to change what you do to chase the money, and that can be very dangerous for nonprofits in terms of achieving their mission. And then also, because there's so many strings attached, you run the risk of letting your organization grow too large and too bureaucratic, having over professionalism and over specification and specialization in certain positions. And that can kind of suck the soul out of a nonprofit organization. Um, Something else to think about is that sometimes you're going to be competing with for-profit organizations for people to provide your services. If you think back to how I was mentioning healthcare, um, you know, uh, we've seen like the super fancy hospitals and the run-down hospitals, the quality of the buildings. That doesn't always necessarily reflect on the quality of care that you might get. But that is one factor where for-profit companies and health systems do have the potential to, spend more, have big fancy buildings to try and attract patients. Um, when you're in the nonprofit world, usually you're running on a really tight budget, and that can really make it difficult to get financing for those big fancy buildings, what we call the capital assets. And it can make it difficult for you to achieve economies of scale, and the efficiencies that you get from, being able to, maybe purchase in bulk or do certain things, um, more quickly and easily. Um, and also, nonprofits tend to have lower salaries and it makes it difficult to compete for high quality employees. I'll actually get into that in a bit during our fourth module about human resources and motivation and volunteerism and things like that. Also, there are the restrictions on lobbying that nonprofits face that for-profit companies don't. And for-profits sometimes get to cherry pick their clients, and that can improve their outcome measures and make them look better than they might actually be. So that can really be a double whammy when we're thinking about nonprofit organizations that really tend to serve the harder cases. So, I think the Shriners hospitals are a great example of this. They really do take on some of the hardest cases. And, uh, you know, from the time they pick you up until the time that you're released, all of your expenses and everything is covered. Well, doing that and having such greater costs makes them look not quite as attractive as some for-profit clinics, even though they do phenomenal work. So all of that just to get us into, some of the different ways that nonprofits use partnerships. Um, Corporate partnerships are one of the most common things that nonprofits do, and they take a lot of different forms. The first is licensing agreements. Sometimes for-profit companies will license out the name of a nonprofit, sell their shirts, or or a T-shirt with their logo on it, or other particular products that may be niche or relating to the nonprofit's mission. Corporate sponsorships are very, very common at all sizes and scales of nonprofits. And this is where, a corporation, some for-profit company is going to help fundraise for an event. They donate money. They give money to the nonprofit for the event or for a program in exchange for having, some recognition, putting their name in the program, putting your logo up along the side of the ballpark. We've all seen that. There's also what we call cause marketing. And this is where like a percentage of sales go to from either a certain item or on a certain day goes to a nonprofit. This usually, and you see this a lot with RSOs at like Panera and Tropical Smoothie and stuff like that on Western's campus. And you can get a little bit of money, but typically they're not going to raise a huge amount of money. And often it turns out to be a better win for the for-profit company because it's helping with their marketing as well and making them look good. Um, you also see this every fall with the Susan G. Komen Foundation and, what some of us refer to as pink washing because, everything, the NFL dresses up in pink jerseys and everything's got pink all over it and your yogurt lids and things like that. That's something that they're very effective at leveraging. Operational partnerships can happen. And this is where you work together. You might, you see this in human services. So think about, rehabilitation clinics or, organizations that serve people who need reskilling or, may be experiencing homelessness or transitioning out of prison. These types of organizations will also often partner with for-profit companies to develop workforce training and to get them into the workforce and help do that as some sort of part of their overall rehabilitation program. And then you can have what we call joint ventures. And this is like an operational partnership on steroids. And this is where you actually share operational responsibility with a for-profit company. A great example of this is the National Geographic Channel. The National Geographic Society, those iconic covers and, the yellow border around the cover of the magazine. That's a not-for-profit organization, the National Geographic Society. Well, they partnered up with I forget who the parent company of it was, but just, basically the Discovery Channel and those corporate overlords to establish the National Geographic Channel. And it's, it's got its strengths, it's got its weaknesses. It's definitely a lot more edutainment now than it was when it first was launched. And I want to say the late 90s, early 2000s. But it is, it has been successful and still is out there on, I subscribe to YouTube TV to watch sports and stuff, and National Geographic is right there as an option. But there are potential downsides here, and please excuse the barking dog outside. Um, so some of the potential downsides are, first of all, having the operational partnership and having a for-profit entity that is so tightly involved can potentially distract the nonprofit organization from its mission. Also, it's, there's a risk of financial loss here. If you're going into, you're making large investments into this joint venture, there's always some sort of risk. And also the IRS regulations on joint ventures between nonprofit and for-profit organizations are pretty complicated, and there's going to be additional compliance costs there. So it's definitely something that, is going to take a lot of time and, really focused attention on specifying roles and relationships and what have you. But I'll get back to that in a minute. So there are a lot of different reasons why you might want to build a partnership. Sometimes, you're going to want to share resources. Maybe that's office space or, part-time accountants or training resources, or, maybe in some cases, newer or, new nonprofits or new projects that aren't quite off the ground yet work with other nonprofits under a arrangement that we refer to as a fiscal sponsorship, where the established nonprofit is actually providing, it's basically lending its IRS tax exempt status to this new organization until it gets on its feet and gets all of its paperwork and ducks in a row and finances. And so that enables it to go out and raise money as an exempt organization without having to have gone through the entire process just yet. Enhancing organizational capacity. So organizational capacity is basically everything an organization needs to get its work done, to achieve its mission. There's a concept that we've referred to as organizational slack. I'll get into this a bit more in the next module, but it's the idea, if you think about a rubber band, you generally want your organization and its capacity to be kind of loose, because when times of stress and strain come on, like, I don't know, we have a global pandemic that shuts the world down for months at a time, that increased stress, and organizations had to stretch their resources in a lot of different ways until things like PPP loans and other national programs came into being. So if you don't have a lot of slack in your organization, partnerships might be a good idea. If you're competing with clients, or there are a lot of organizations in one geographic area that do similar work, it's not a bad idea to get a hold of one another and start collaborating. Sometimes the priorities of funders change, and that might be according to political reasons. It might just be according to, general trends in the nonprofit sector. It's also possible, sometimes there's just simply that financial or a managerial necessity. Maybe there are practical needs that you've got from a programmatic perspective, excuse me, that some other organization might be able to assist with. So, I mean, those are all really good rationales, but they're not, it's not an exhaustive list. And, there might be different reasons why you want to partner up or not partner up with other organizations. And so, with that, let me tell you a little bit about what some of the problems might be. So, there are some obstacles to collaborating. If you've got very different motivations for wanting to collaborate in the first place, that's not going to make for a good partnership. Differences in organizational culture. If you've got one organization that's like, ratty t-shirts, shorts, and flip-flops all year, maybe Uggs in the winter, um, and then a much more corporate-esque nonprofit that's very suit and tie and what have you, that's already an indicator that we're probably not going to get along real well. And that's going to be a different culture to reconcile when you've got to start working together. Something similar is ego issues. A lot of the time, unfortunately, nonprofits there are turf wars and people who want to claim a lot of the credit or all of the credit for partnerships. And these things can really become a problem when you get into collaborations that involve two or more nonprofit organizations. And then cost concerns. If you're working together with another organization, that means that you're diverting your time away from your core work, usually, and there's going to be a cost that comes along with that. Um, so sometimes it just might not make sense. But yeah, there are a lot of great partnerships that are out there. And so also I've got here some of the characteristics of really good ones. So, being mission driven. Um, you know, making sure that the CEOs and top executives at the organization are supportive of the collaboration. Because if the people at the top don't believe in it, well, how's that going to trickle down to everybody else? Um, Having trust both between the two organizations, but also between the employees of the two or more organizations. And then, how related are the organizations? Are they completely different? If so, that might not be a good collaboration. And then, really carefully designing and specifying the process is so important. Now, before you do set up a collaboration, there are some things that you might want to ask yourself. First of all, how is this going to help us achieve our mission? The other organization has its own mission and vision and values and all that. But what about ours? Is this going to contribute or is this us just helping them? What's in it for me? How's this going to work operationally? Who's in charge of what? How do we communicate? How frequently are we going to communicate? How is data going to be shared? Who is going to be responsible for the accounting and finance side of whatever it is that we're implementing? What's the time frame? Is this an open-ended partnership, or are we just going to work together for the next 6 months, 2 years to get something off the ground? Um, how closely are we going to have to work together? Again, how often are we going to have to meet? Is this going to be a daily thing, a weekly thing? Do we just check in once a quarter? And then finally, I wanted to mention here about the risk of what I call organizational inbreeding. Um, One thing that people who join boards of directors for nonprofits find is that once you're on one, you usually get asked to be on a few others. And there are a lot of different related organizations in a given geographic area, and the same different people tend to run in the same different circles. And so organizational inbreeding just means that there's a lot of cross-pollination between organizations that are very similar or, like-minded. And it can become problematic when that stifles innovation and just becomes an echo chamber for one another. Or when you develop turf wars and there's even more inbreeding in smaller clusters of groups that try and provide similar or related services. So, all right, that's it for this video. Next up, we'll talk about how governments work together or don't.